Can I start? Yes, okay, cool. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. It's great to see such a crowded room. We are going to talk about, in case you didn't know where you ended up, we're going to talk about nuclear weapons and how we can translate knowledge of risk about nuclear weapons into policies. And for that, we have a really stellar panel today. So just to my left here is Dr. Tobias Feller. He is the head of the Challenges to Deep Cuts project at the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg. His research focuses on arms control and issues of strategic stability under conditions of great power competition. And his focus is on US-Russia relations and the potential inclusion of the People's Republic of China in arms control. Then we have Santhi Hall, who is a longtime prominent disarmament activist and expert and campaigner, who serves as co-director for the German affiliate of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. She is also a co-founder of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. And then we have Jannis Kappelmann, who is a PhD student and researcher at the University of Hamburg. His research focuses on nuclear weapons governance, norms, gender, and humanitarian perspectives on disarmament and international security. Online, I don't know if we can already see our speakers online. Yes, thank you so much. So online, we're very honored to welcome George Wilhelm Gallhofer, who is the head of disarmament and nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation and delivery systems at the Austrian Foreign Ministry, and also Merle Spellerberg, who is a member of the German Bundestag, where she is the deputy foreign policy spokesperson for Bündnis 90, die Grünen. She works on topics including disarmament and peace policy, NATO, Eastern Europe, and feminist foreign policy as well. Thank you all so much for being here and taking the time. So before we dive right into the topic, I thought I would start us off a little bit unconventionally by reading a poem, which was written by a young activist from Fiji, and it refers to some of the nuclear weapons tests that the United States conducted in the 1950s and 1960s in Oceania, and specifically the Castle Bravo test of 1954 in the Bikini Atoll. And so the poem is called I Walk Bravo. And it goes like this. My skin is sun-kissed, but my body is bravo. Bravo, that's what the outsiders say for well done. The Italians think it means brave, but you know what I think? Bravo is a cell injected in my body about to explode. Bravo is a substance reaction that made my boo-boo blind. Bravo is a deliberate performance in the sky, a calculated, invisible to camouflage the visible. Burn tears, burn dry. Bravo is my siblings born a defect machine. Bravo is a gene I pass, a replicate of a poisonous culture. But you know, my island, a castle before Bravo. And so with this, I was hoping to ground us a little bit in the reality of nuclear weapons and how they've affected people. And so I wanted to start maybe a little bit more academically. How can we understand nuclear risk? What do we mean when we talk about nuclear risk in this panel? And maybe we want to start with you, Dr. Feller.
Yes, thanks so much for your time, and also for your time, of course. I want to start with a short tour de force through nuclear arms control and nuclear risk. And I have prepared 3 punchlines, 3 points for you. The first is that we are living in an era where formalized bilateral US-Russia arms control is in decline. The second point I want to make is to explain to you why that is the case and what is the reason for this decline. And the third point would be to explain what does this decline mean for European and global security. And I also prepared some policy recommendations for you, Merle, of course. But maybe would be fine to do it in the discussion after my input. As I said, the highly formalized US-Russia arms nuclear arms control is in decline. And with that, the associated cooperative security architecture that contributed to European security in the middle and late Cold War and beyond. You know that Russia has suspended the New START treaty on strategic arms reduction, and we have no INF treaty to ban medium and shorter range grounded launch missiles anymore. The ABM treaty to limit anti-ballistic missile defense systems is also over, and we go to the conventional level. Russia has decided to withdraw from the multilateral CFE treaty, which aims at a conventional balance in Europe at a lower level than in the Cold War, and also wants to eliminate capabilities for surprise attacks. And while under Trump, the US has already withdrawn from the Open Skies Treaty, which allows treaty participants to fly over each other's territories and to monitor military activities and military locations. So in short, the situation is very bad and the risks are very high. Why is that the case? What is the reason for this decline in European and global security? I think firstly, right now we are in an era where the world politics, great powers are realigning. What do I mean by that? We have great powers switching to a conflict mode. We have American unipolarity and dominance is under pressure, at least under pressure. We have the rise of China, of course, also when it comes to nuclear warheads. The DoD says the number of nuclear warheads is now 410, and until 2035, it will be 1,500 nuclear warheads. And we also have the rise of the so-called global south, powers like India and South Africa and also Brazil. And we had last weekend the G7 summit in Hiroshima, where you really saw this new emerging world order. You saw the G7 countries trying to form a common front against Russia and also against China. We have the nuclear topic we had there, and also the G7 tried really to reach out to India at the G7 summit. The second point I want to make is the nuclear component of the Ukrainian war. We have Russian threats with nukes, among others with Ukraine against a state that surrendered its nuclear arsenal inherited from the Soviet Union in exchange for security guarantees. We have a severely damaged NPT, also non-proliferation treaty, in which the 5 recognized nuclear weapon states pledge to disarm, and the rest of the world declares the reunification of the bomb. And although the nuclear taboo is damaged, according to which the use of nuclear weapons is unacceptable because of the destructive power and consequences. And also kind of a new development is that Russia took nuclear arms control hostage in suspending New START in order to achieve a Western change of course in Ukraine. And this kind of ends an era where strategic arms control was excluded from the great power rivalry between the US and Russia. Third, we have a decline in arms control due to technological developments like the rise of AI or the blending of military sectors. Fourth, we have the domestic polarization of the United States. We have a grand old party, GOP. For them, arms control with autocracies is almost a no-go. And the fifth point I want to make is right now in Western society, I guess we have kind of an inability or unwillingness to deal with other logics and to question ourselves and really to change ourselves, our behaviors. Where we like to point fingers, we like to stay inside of our bubble, to reinforce our arguments, and we have kind of, for us, it's becoming very difficult to engage with different opinions. We define ourselves as a universal idea, and then we wonder what happens next. So what does this mean for European and global security, for risk? We have nuclear escalation danger is greater today than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. We had incidents like a Russian missile impact in Poland, a drone crash over the Black Sea, and also the incident where a Russian pilot tried to launch a missile against a British aircraft and just had luck. That was a malfunction in the system. We have also risk of misunderstandings or past dependencies. That the Russian nuclear warheads for tactical nukes are at storages, and when the Russians would move them out, bring them to the missile launchers. There would be, of course, past dependencies that Putin maybe wouldn't have the, would think that he can't go back because he would now, the people would say that he is weak, for example. And we also have new weapon technologies, like hypersonic weapons, which are very, very fast and very good in maneuvering and very costly. So for the other side, when, let's say, Russia uses a hypersonic missile against a Western target, for example, in Poland, let's say, then Poland wouldn't have much time, to how to decide to respond to this. And the same goes for nuclear powers within NATO. So even when Russia, it could be the case that the United States would then think, okay, that is kind of Russia is preparing a first strike, and that is a danger. And we also have the danger of a limited nuclear war in Europe, like in the Cold War, when the US and the Soviet Union were thinking maybe we can limit a nuclear war in the middle of Europe, like in Western and Eastern Germany. And of course, we also have the proliferation threat when you think of Iran, North Korea, South Korea, also missile or nuclear technology proliferation from, for example, from Russia to China. So we have various threats and really a very, very high level of risk. Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much for painting that sort of picture of the strategic situation that we're in. Jannis, do you want to add anything to this understanding of risk?
Yes, of course. And thank you so much for this introduction. I think this can be probably supplemented by another idea, and the idea would be the first one I thought of when I luckily got this invite. Thank you so much for letting me speak here. When I read about nuclear risk, I asked myself, nuclear risk for whom? Who is at risk here? And I think there's a lot of nuclear risks that differ depending on who you ask. And this also has to do with how the nuclear order is structured. I also want to probably go through 3 quick points on that. And the first one is that if you look at the history of nuclear tests and use, you can very clearly see that hasn't been wasn't done equally. The risk of the nuclear testing from the nuclear weapon states tended to be outsourced to other communities. When we, for instance, speak about the United States have been testing in the Pacific. We heard the poem from the Bikini Atoll, which is now Marshall Islands, now very advocating very loudly for nuclear disarmament. They've also tested in Nevada, as most of you I think know. And also in Nevada, if you look at the populations that were affected in Nevada, we can see that those are mostly marginalized communities, indigenous populations, Mormons who were stripped of agency at that time. There are even allegations in some research papers that the decision to attack Hiroshima and Nagasaki might also have been underpinned by racialized considerations. And not only the US, but also the other countries that conducted nuclear tests always did that where marginalized groups, where people look different than in the capital. The USSR tested in Kazakhstan and in an island in the north. You've just been in a session on the Arctic, right? Novaya Zemlya is the island, and there as well, indigenous people and people who were different than those in Moscow were affected. The UK tested in Australia and the Pacific. France tested in Algeria and the Pacific. And by now you might guess where China tested. China tested in Xinjiang, and mostly Uyghur population was affected. That's the one point, the one big thing. Nuclear testing and the nuclear risk that's being outsourced there. Very similar thing goes on for the mining that largely also affects marginalized people. There's a great book that I can recommend to you if you want to read further on that, which I encourage you to do, Gabriele Hecht, on nuclear mining in Africa. And the third thing I want to talk about is the nuclear order and what how risk plays a role there. Because we've already heard from Tobias that the NPT has sort of a deal, right? And this deal, from my understanding, is that the non-nuclear weapon states offer non-proliferation. They promise we're not going to acquire nuclear weapons, and they trade that for two things. First, the assistance with the peaceful use of nuclear technology, and the second one, disarmament. And I think the non-proliferation largely worked. Only DPRK, so North Korea, withdrew from the NPT treaty. The NPT, most accounts would say, prevented further proliferation. All the proliferation happened, but the estimates in the 60s were much higher than actually materialized. And also assistance with peaceful use is happening in some regions even increasingly. But, and Tobias also said that, and I'm sure others will say that on the panel as well, the disarmament side of this treaty hasn't really materialized to sufficiency. Yes, there was a reduction of nuclear weapons since the Cold War, but we know also from ICJ decisions that that's not what the NPT means by disarmament. That means that we have to come to conclusion and work towards global zero of nuclear weapons. There are other issues as well that determine unequal risk. Women have more severely affected by radiation. The ability to influence decisions also, influences how nuclear risk is unevenly distributed. But in the end, I would say that, and we're going to talk about this as well, probably, even if you assume that nuclear weapons increase your security, which is, I think, something to discuss about. Even if you assume that, then you can see that the security of some states was increased, and the risk was largely outsourced to other populations.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that as well. And before we talk a little bit about the challenges actually in translating sort of all of these things that we know about into policy, I just wanted to ask you, Santi, you told me before that you thought we were facing a new quality of risk at the moment. What do you think makes this current moment so unique in terms of the risks that we face?
Right. Well, if you'd asked me that question in 2021, I would have started talking about the problem that all the nuclear weapon states are modernizing their arsenals, that they're going more for low-yield weapons or a mixture, so it's harder to know what it is that's coming at you, and that there were more countries, looking at nuclear weapons as an option, or the whole problem with the Iran deal. Those were already there in the last years. There were already, risk was going up. People were talking about we're having a new, possibly a new Cold War. But since the invasion of Ukraine, I think personally this has all suddenly become much, much worse. And I think we have to really sit up and take notice of what is happening to us in the world right now, that we're being taken hostage by nuclear deterrence. And I don't just say Russia there, although I think Russia is principally the actor that is threatening us with nuclear weapons, implicitly and explicitly. But this is also, we've had the warnings before, right? In the 60s, Nixon was the example of the madman theory. You may have read about that. It's the idea of showing an unpredictability in your rationality to get rid of the idea that one would suspect that you wouldn't use nuclear weapons. That's Nixon started that, and Trump took it up with North Korea. Kim Jong-un was quite happy to play the part of the madman theory as well. But Putin is really using this for psychological warfare on us now. We're absolutely in an unpredictable situation that we really don't know how to respond to. And everybody is sort of floundering to answer this question, will he or won't he use nuclear weapons? And nobody has an answer to that question. I don't, I'm sure the other panelists don't. We can only tell you what we think. And as far as I'm concerned, that's the riskiest situation you can be in, is when you can only just say, well, maybe he will, maybe he won't. I mean, that's our lives we're talking about. That's our planet we're talking about. And we don't really know the answer to this. So that's one reason that I'd say that this risk has greater quality. I also think that Putin's speeches on returning to a kind of Soviet era and the national identity question of somehow he's turned it into almost a spiritual question of whether or not they win this war, means that the likelihood of accepting anything like defeat is almost impossible. The only way that that they could possibly really win this war is probably with the use of nuclear weapons, and that's the scary part about it. It's certainly true that if the West decided in any way to intervene and go into a direct confrontation with Russia, it is impossible that they could defeat Russia without nuclear weapons being used on both sides. I would say probably on the Russian side, but maybe on both sides. So we're really talking about nuclear weapons use here. And what is happening is there's an erosion of the nuclear taboo, which we've had for over 75 years, where everybody says they should never be used again. We were all agreed on that. There's also the legal obligation to disarm entirely and never to use nuclear weapons again. But this is now being openly talked about, certainly in Russia, also through state propaganda. It's been openly talked about that nuclear weapons could be used. It's being normalized so that they're actually including the population of Russia in the idea it could happen. And we're also we're trying to avoid this discussion in the West. We're just not talking about it. We're just trying to say, okay, well, we think it's just a bluff. But I think that we need to take it seriously. We need to think about how we can get ourselves back down from this situation and how to, find an exit strategy to this war in order for it not to go nuclear. So I think the nuclear risk is higher than I have ever known, and I have lived through, I'm a child of the Cold War, and as a child, we were daily talking about nuclear war. We were talking about how to survive a nuclear war. I got a pamphlet from my government telling me how to build a bunker inside my own house. So we were really, it was right in our face then, but I think the situation now is even more dangerous than then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you all three. And for those of you who are only just joining us now, we have already been talking today at the conference a little bit about the ways, and I think some of you also alluded to this, in which it seems like luck has been our policy so far on nuclear weapons, or our strategy on nuclear weapons. And so thank you, all of you, for so far pointing out sort of what this means in a context that we are in with increased levels of strategic uncertainty and quite irrational or like madman theories or types of approaches to policy making, and of course also the unequal effects that we have despite and in addition to all of these compounded sort of problems. So to turn also to our two panelists online, so I would like to actually hear a response from each of you on the next question, which is basically, what do you think is the biggest challenge right now? What is keeping us from implementing what we know about risks of nuclear weapons into our policies? And maybe, George Wilhelm Gallhofer, maybe we can start with you, because Austria actually has taken a different path, and maybe you could talk to us a little bit about why Austria is translating knowledge of risk into policy.
Thank you very much, and thank you also from my side for having me, and thanks for the excellent points that were already made by the previous panelists. Yeah, I'd like to sort of touch on two aspects particularly, if I may. One being the waypoint that we find ourselves on the one hand, and the other being how we try to shift the discourse a bit away from the norms that we've had and the approaches that we've had that really haven't managed to get us towards the nuclear disarmament that we expected when we negotiated the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It was already alluded to 60 years ago, this October, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, and you had Cuba's President Castro sending a letter to President Khrushchev urging him to launch a nuclear first strike against the United States. But instead, Khrushchev sent a letter to President Kennedy in which he called for working together to de-escalate the conflict and to ensure that they did not doom the world to the catastrophe of thermonuclear war. And that's what paved the way for a solution for these 13 days of intense nuclear crisis. That's the closest we've come to a nuclear war since the dawn of the nuclear age, but that's until now. And with what's already been mentioned, the nuclear Russian threats and the nuclear blackmail, we now face an existential choice. Do the countries possessing nuclear weapons double down on nuclear deterrence and risks others following their lead? Or do we realize the fundamental fragility of a system of international security based on the constant threat of mutual annihilation and catastrophic consequences that know no borders? And this is what led us to an urgent call for a paradigm shift that's been in the making now for over 10 years, when a couple of countries, mine included, also ICANN and the ICRC and others in civil society, decided that we needed to have a refocusing of the debate. As others have said already, nuclear disarmament fora and the discourse on nuclear weapons has been dominated by the 5 nuclear-armed states in the NPT and their allies, with the consensus requirement to negotiation making any real progress impossible, as those countries would not allow anything that would seriously challenge nuclear deterrence. But this dominance was challenged by a reframing of the debate and by looking at the actual implications of nuclear deterrence in the framework of the humanitarian initiative, by gathering scientific data and expertise on the humanitarian consequences and the inherent risks of nuclear weapons. It led us to examine what nuclear deterrence actually implies. So nuclear deterrence theory first requires credible nuclear strike and counter-strike capabilities to impose unacceptable costs on the adversary. And secondly, it requires that all actors believe in the resolve that nuclear weapons will be used. Nuclear deterrence therefore then holds hostage entire populations in the hope that leaders will be rational enough never to use these weapons and will not risk their own population to an assured counter-strike. Not only does such an approach assume that all risk of misunderstanding, accident, or rationality can be entirely eliminated, but it also glosses over the fact that these unacceptable risks are borne by the entire international community. All of humanity carries the nuclear risks, and the whole world would suffer consequences if nuclear deterrence were to fail. We highlighted the many cases of near misses and accidents in the humanitarian initiative, which showed how often humanity has avoided disaster by sheer luck, as you just mentioned. We also looked at the impact of what would happen if nuclear deterrence were to fail. And here, maybe the most consequential new evidence on the humanitarian consequences relates to the fact that even a so-called limited nuclear war, using only a small fraction of today's arsenals, could lead to a nuclear winter. Huge amounts of soot would be transported by firestorms that would result from nuclear explosions into higher layers of the atmosphere, and this would disperse across the globe, leading to a nuclear winter lasting several years, with significant temperature drops in most moderate climate areas. Staple food production would be severely impacted globally, and furthermore, it was shown that it is impossible to appropriately address the immediate humanitarian emergency and the long-term consequences of nuclear weapon detonations. Now, these facts raise profound legal and ethical issues and questions about the legitimacy of the nuclear status quo. A nuclear conflict simply knows no borders, and the global consequences are far more severe and profound than previously understood. And therefore, by definition, nuclear disarmament must concern all states, and not just the 5 that possess them in the NPT. And this democratization of the discourse found its culminating point in a process that led to the treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons. Motivated by the unacceptable lack of progress on nuclear disarmament and empowered by the facts on their risks and consequences, a clear majority of countries have negotiated this landmark treaty. And we followed the examples of previous humanitarian treaties like the Anti-Personnel Landmine Treaty and shifted the discourse away from who should have nuclear weapons and who should not, as you have it in the NPT, as Jannis rightly alluded to establishing that the risks are too high and the consequences simply unacceptable, and therefore no state should have these weapons anymore. International security cannot be sustainably based on the constant threat of annihilation. It cannot be based on security of a few at the expense of all others. And the TPNW is the clear expression of the majority of countries who voted to adopt it, that they do not see nuclear deterrence as a valid or legitimate concept for international security. We've chosen our path in the current fork of the road, and with the PPNW, we have also provided for an alternative approach to international security. Now, of course, nobody's under any illusion that the treaty will make nuclear weapons disappear tomorrow, but its subtle effects are already starting to bear fruit and provide a platform for actual progress on nuclear disarmament, which is more urgent today than ever. So I thank you, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much. Ms. Spellerberg, if I can actually just pick up on something that Mr. Gallhofer just said, which I thought was a really interesting point. So basically, Mr. Gallhofer, the way you framed it was Austria saw and did studies and looked at the impact of nuclear weapons on the humanitarian consequences, on the question of sort of the avoidability of basically making nuclear war a global issue, on security, those kinds of issues. And then you consequently adopted a policy that was seeking to challenge that. And this is not actually something that we're seeing happening. This cause and effect is not something that we're seeing happening in a lot of countries. And so, Ms. Spellerberg, maybe you could talk us through a little bit, why is, for example, Germany not following this interpretation? What is the difference in analysis maybe that you have perceived in your country?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. I would have loved to be in Munich with you as well. Mm-hmm. And I can hear myself, so maybe there would be a way to change that. Otherwise, I'll just try to continue, but it's a bit irritating.
Maybe you can try to turn your sound on your computer off while you're speaking to us.
Okay, well, we'll see how that goes. Okay, so I think, first of all, I wouldn't necessarily say that Germany does not share everything that was just said, because Germany and the new coalition have participated at the MSP in Vienna as well to observe the TPNW, because we and the government is aware of the fact that the nuclear weapons pose as a risk as long as nuclear weapons exists. So, of course, there is the one side that the government can say, and then obviously I, as an MP, as a Green MP, have an even stronger opinion. And I think maybe that's more interesting from my side to say. Of course, I can say, for example, how I view the G7 summit, or especially the G7 summit compared to the G20. But I think what the main thing that is interesting for a parliamentarian is also how we as parliamentarians can actually be involved in what we can do facing all the risks that were just already named by all the scientists, by all of you before, which I don't want to repeat in that context. So I think, especially in in face of the rising nuclear threats, and at a time when states in Europe are forced to use weapons to support those under attack in a brutal illegal war, and at a time when international arms control negotiations have stalled, we need the strong network of parliamentarians committed to disarmament and non-proliferation. And I think one network where we do see that is the one from ICANN, which was mentioned already, where we met in Oslo a few weeks ago to also look at how especially NATO states and parliamentarians from NATO states can act and push for nuclear disarmament. And I think there have been a few positive developments next to the TPNW or in collaboration with that. So, for example, in France, there have been 59 MPs who recently urged President Macron also to start engaging with the TPNW, which is probably not going to happen, let's be honest, but at least it's a step that there are parliamentarians as well who mention that and who push for that. And I think also that especially disarmament and arms control must be pursued not despite, but actually because of Russia's war against Ukraine. And that, of course, is a practical as well as rhetorical challenge, but we really must push against the normalization of the nuclear threat discourse in our politics that was already touched upon earlier. And for example, I already mentioned NATO. I think for us, it is really important that on the one hand, we really are in favor of the TPNW, but then again, we're still a member of NATO and we still have nuclear sharing. So what we decided for is on the one hand to support the TPNW as an observer, but on the other hand, to really push inside of the NATO for a change of this nuclear deterrence ideology, if you can actually call it like that. And of course, that's baby steps. But for example, at the Parliamentary Assembly of the NATO, there have been a few parliamentarians, including me, who tried to go for an amendment at the draft declaration to really start this debate inside NATO as well. Because I think in the long run, we need to change how we talk about nuclear deterrence inside NATO as well in order to get a change there. And yeah, that's something we've been working on, and it's probably going to take a while, but if I can talk about the NATO PA and that more, but I think I already talked quite well. So if you want to know more, just ask.
Yeah, thank you so much. And also already for pointing out a little bit the role of that parliamentarians play. That is definitely something. Yes, I saw you. Just 1 second. Just to remind our panelists, so it's about 20 to 6 now. So I know we have a rather large panel and the questions are big and important, but just to try and confine our sort of speeches to a little bit more so that everybody has another chance to go. So in general, and everybody will have another chance to go, just to make that clear also. So again, sort of, you were already sort of to respond, so please do, yes.
So no PowerPoint for me.
Yes, please.
I wanted to answer to Merle. And I think when you look at the German discourse on arms control or on the Ukraine war, and even when you look to the States, but it's kind of different there, you really should recall the old formula that arms control is not for friends. So arms control is no charity. You can say we have to contain Russia and China, but we have to really kind of reach and push for a certain level of strategic stability. I think that's very, very important for now, because right now when you're doing peace research, you kind of, sometimes you're termed or called an appeaser, for example, but really you can say, you can argue for deterrence and can say arms control is part of deterrence, because through arms control agreements and mechanisms, the other side can look into your arsenal and say that's what we have, and that can deter the other side. That's one point. And when it comes to deterrence theory and this so-called nuke speech, that rationalizes really crazy and very dangerous things. You can change the discourse in deconstructing the speech, of, let's say, counterforce. Counterforce are targets with military value, and there's so-called counter-value targets. That's an euphemism, for targeting civilians. That's the rhetoric of nuclear deterrence. And I think that's very, very important to change the discourse, and that's really an important task for civil society. And when you look to international law, there are so-called emerging norms that really can emerge when you repeat things as a state, as a parliamentarian, and as a society. You can push for that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, yes, exactly. I was just about to say, Santi, you probably have something to respond to that. And also, if you want to just mention briefly, what do you think currently is the biggest challenge? And ICANN has been mentioned repeatedly, the civil society movements have been mentioned repeatedly. What is in your toolbox right now to respond to these challenges?
Well, one of the things is that the general mainstream way of thinking is that nuclear deterrence needs this strategic stability, is what you were talking about. And we've kind of come out of that situation now. There is no more strategic stability, in my view. It's not a question of parity anymore. It's a question of how to resolve this situation and actually, build down so the escalation doesn't continue. And one of the things this is another of the games that Putin has played. So he's taken the nuclear sharing question and has decided to play it to his advantage by saying, I'm going to put nuclear weapons into Belarus because that's what you're doing, And this was always the danger. It was repeatedly said beforehand from civil society, if you continue with nuclear sharing, at some point, one of the other nuclear weapon states is going to say, well, we'll do the same thing. And I think the argument was, maybe Pakistan would do it. And a lot of people were like, oh my God, Pakistan doing nuclear sharing, who with, And now Putin has said, we're going to put nuclear weapons into Belarus. We're going to train the Belarusian soldiers. I'm struggling with that adjective there, to use nuclear weapons. So what are we talking about here? If we want parity, what we should be looking at is trying to agree that on both sides there shouldn't be nuclear sharing, that we should be saying that's out the window. That would be a wonderful first measure to try to talk about, stopping nuclear sharing on all sides. And then at least we would know, the nuclear weapons could only be based in the nuclear weapon states and not in other states. That would be one of the things that I would suggest. And I want to go to this challenge, the question of the challenge, to why is it that we can't translate risk into policy? And that's partly to do with an innate sense of disbelief that it can be done. That, people just don't believe that we can get rid of nuclear weapons. We don't believe in the change that's necessary. You hear this all the time. It's like people, when they speak to me, say, it's a lovely idea, getting rid of all nuclear weapons, would love to do it, but it's not possible. This is the real world that we're living in. You're somewhere in cloud cuckoo land. Now, the fact is that if you look at history, there's all sorts of things that have been done that we didn't think we could do. We didn't think that the wall would come down. I can remember that very clearly, living in West Berlin, when people said, when the wall comes down, everybody would laugh at them and say, that will never happen. We also said we would never actually phase out nuclear energy in Germany. We did. Of course, it took Fukushima to make us do that, and let's hope that we don't need to have the use of nuclear weapons to actually decide to get rid of nuclear weapons. But, we abolished slavery. The women got the vote. All of these things were thought of as being impossible at the time. But it is not impossible. Change is definitely possible. And I've been working on this subject for 40 years now. I was 19 when I started doing it. And it is a question of moving 1 millimeter at a time. Sometimes we take big steps. In the 90s, we took a lot of big steps with new treaties and a lot of success. And then sometimes you have rollback, and that's what's happening right now. But I urge everybody in this room to grab hold of the idea that we can be optimistic about change, even if things are looking really, really grim. We have to get through this situation, and we have to learn from it. And I think that's really what I mostly would like to tell you today.
Thank you so much for that. Jannis, another element of obviously of this debate is we talk a lot about living in a post-truth era, those kinds of aspects, but still scientists have actually made a lot of contributions to establishing what are humanitarian consequences, how can we actually physically get rid of nuclear weapons, all of these elements. You're a researcher. What do you think is the role of research in describing what our challenges are and also in tackling them, maybe?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that what we have now, that probably brings me also to the point that I wanted to make to the norms and so on. What we're seeing right now is that, George Willem, for instance, also cited new studies, and I'm hearing that increasingly from diplomacy and politics. We're seeing a new access to also question the norms that are in place. Access for scientists as well, but also access for other actors who do knowledge production. I mean, Xanthi has said you worked on this topic since you were 19. So of course you also do knowledge production, right? And what we're seeing now also is that the boundaries between science and or academia in general and activism are getting more blurred as academia evolves, right? Because academia asks itself, what are we doing here, and is it so different to knowledge production that other people do? And I think that's good, and I think all these groups, activists, academics are now involved, and I think what we can see is that norms actually can change, and we have seen that very often in history. We have seen human rights and the rise of human rights. So we can also change norms when it comes to nuclear weapons. And I think there's evidence for that. I think there's evidence that also the norms toward disarmament or are changing. If we look at the TPNW, George Willem has said that a majority of states now support the TPNW. Merle Spellerberg has talked about the MPs in France pressuring the government. I think this is also a discursive shift that involves norms. The German government really recently has issued guidelines on feminist foreign policy and couldn't help but also include nuclear weapons in there, right? And that's good. That's also a thing we have to talk about when we think about feminist foreign policy. They also support disarmament in there. If you look at the German election manifestos of parties, you can also see that there's a change, probably because of DPNW. Maybe this is also something to do that we have to talk about that. And we can see that norms change, but we can also see, that's my last sentence, I promise, because we want to get on, that the access to contestation changes. So if you look at the process of the TPNW, more people were involved in actually drafting this treaty, and it was not the P5, the classic states that do international politics, but it was also states from the global south that were heavily involved. It was activists, academics, also feminist activists in particular, communities affected by nuclear weapons testing. So a huge a huge chunk of people was involved there, and that does something on how norms evolve.
Mm-hmm. Merle Spellerberg, I was actually seeing you react to this a little bit. I mean, you already talked us through a little bit the role of parliamentarians, but since Jannis Kappelmann just brought it up again, do you want to walk us through a little bit more about what parliamentarians are doing to address this challenge?
I'd love to. So I think there are different ways, and then the headphones don't work, so I'm just gonna make you without. I'm just not gonna hear you while I talk. I think there are different levels in which parliamentarians engage. One is, of course, the parliament itself. So that means, for example, in the Bundestag, that we're having debates inside the subcommittee for disarmament, arms control, and non-proliferation, and that we're talking to the government in that committee, and that we're having hearings on the issue. That's of course one thing. And the second thing is the international collaboration of parliamentarians. For example, with the ICANN, but also there's the network from the PNND with a broader range of parliamentarians that does not necessarily support the TPNW as much as the ICANN network, but I think it's still important to have a broad number of parliamentarians to engage in that. And for example, especially in the ICANN network, we really share the exact same goal and also a broad range of similar ways to get there. So for example, talking about nuclear weapon-free zones in certain areas of the world, or how to achieve that more member states from NATO join the TPNW in a first step as observer, and then in the second step, of course, as a real member. And I think the third thing that I touched upon earlier is the work that we're doing inside parliamentary assemblies. So that may be the Interparliamentarian Union, which I, to be honest, do not know that much about, but then I already said, the NATO PA. And I think what was really interesting, Xanto, what you've already said, that people say it's not realistic. And I think there's a second thing that people always say, especially since February last year, and that is, now is not the right time. And that's also what we encountered in Luxembourg at the PA. We had this amendment and even got some supporters, but in the end, it was, now is not the right time, even though we actually wanted to say, bearing in mind that the strategic concept of the NATO says that as long as nuclear weapons exist, NATO will remain a nuclear alliance. Even having that added, it was still too much and was not the right time. And I already said that especially now would be the right time, seeing how dangerous nuclear weapons be, and that authoritarian leaders such as Putin should just really not have nuclear weapons, and no one should have nuclear weapons. But I think it was a first try to work with that inside the NATO PA as well. And I think it's important to engage in those conversations, especially with those who do not share your opinion yet.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I mean, Tobias Feller already mentioned this a little bit before, this question of when is the right time. And George Wilhelm, maybe you could talk to us a little bit more about the fact, so what does the TPNW, what does Austria say in engaging with countries who may be on the fence about this question? Is now the right time? When is the right time? Figuring this question out. What do you say to them?
Thank you. Well, we say a few things. First of all, I think very rightly, Merle Spellerberg said, when nuclear risk is highest, that's when you need to sit down. That's when you need to make a change. I mean, if you look at things like the Reagan-Gorbachev statement, when you look at the agreement that you had at the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, we had de-escalation and we had progress because of the crisis, because leaders saw how dangerous this nuclear deterrence theory was, that they realized we need to walk back from it. It's just a risk that we cannot take and that we cannot in good conscience continue. The problem is, of course, we've had many attempts to resolve it, part solutions, but we never really made the full step. For us, it's very much also about making sure that we get the message out about what the actual consequences are. What is it that we're actually doing? What is a nuclear threat? Are we really willing, and do we actually have the democratic legitimization to threaten mass annihilation of another country's civilian population as part of a national security strategy? And in fact, in a nuclear weapon state, are you really willing to, as a population, bear the risk of you being the target of a retaliation strike by a nuclear weapon if your leaders decide to use nuclear weapons. So these are sort of the questions that come to the question of legitimization also of nuclear deterrence. There's this national level that I just mentioned, but there's also the international level, which is what others have touched upon. I very much agree there with Jannis, but also with Xanta's point. The TPNW wasn't thought to be possible. This was thought to be in a sort of, cloud in the sky idea that will never happen and die in, one of the UN bodies that dies because of consensus. But it actually happened, and it happened exactly because of the democratization and the education side of things. Countries suddenly felt that they were entitled to participate in the conversation based on these facts that were developed in the humanitarian initiative conferences. And I think that's sort of where we come down. We want to make sure that actually all those who are affected, that also includes, for example, victims, are at the table and get to have a say also on international security. And that moves away. Now, don't get me wrong, as I said before, nobody in the TPNW expects that suddenly nuclear weapons will disappear tomorrow and everyone will join the TPNW. But it's a process, and it's a process that has shown effect. And Merle Spellerberg alluded to it, Jannis alluded to it. These conversations are happening now. These conversations were also forced onto the agenda in many countries' discussions, international fora, because we now have the TPNW, and there is now a concrete instrument on the table that says, do you still want to continue to base your security on nuclear weapons or nuclear deterrence? And here is an alternative way. So we of course can't, as Austria especially, we can't force the international world to abandon nuclear weapons tomorrow. But in using the multilateral system and using the normative power of international law, we can engage others in the conversation, start to feed the arguments into the fora, and provide a potential pathway. And so this is sort of the contribution we as a small country can make. And it's borne quite a lot of fruit in that way.
Yeah, thank you so much. So we would now ideally go into sort of a final round where I would give each of you again sort of a few minutes to just make some final points. I know that a lot of you came with a lot of points prepared, but even just for this final round, I would love us to keep just as a guiding question in the back of our heads, what actually has to happen next for more countries, or even for some individuals, if you can think of like a specific target of your activism, your research, your policy approaches, to translate knowledge of risk into policy action. And let's just go around the room. So,
okay, I keep it short. In my work, it's really about small steps where all powers can agree upon. That I would argue that you really have to promote this so-called behavioral arms control, which is about the stigmatization and legitimization of certain policies. For example, cyber attacks against nuclear command and control could be stigmatized, or interventions, attacks against early warning satellites, for example. I would argue for us really to save what can be saved from the arms control architecture. For example, trying to influence the United States to take some unilateral steps to save the architecture. For example, share data on nuclear weapons with Russia, for example. Also really, and prepare for a future without a New START treaty. And that would be very important from my perspective. And for civil society, really believe in the power of language, because language is power. Language constructs reality. And it's not just something that describes the world.
Yes, thank you. Actually, before we go to you, just wanted to mention to all of you, after this, we're going to have a Q&A. So you can already start thinking about some questions that you might have to some of our panelists. And also, I don't know where the camera is. For those people joining us online, you can use the YSC website, I think, to send us questions online. So you are not excluded from that. So yeah, sorry, Xanthi.
Yeah, I guess what I really want to get across while I'm here, because this is the Young Security Conference and I'm probably one of the oldest people here, that it's important to understand that history is not created in a vacuum, but is actually shaped by the presiding generation and their fears or their traumas. And I said before, I'm a child of the Cold War, but my parents and my grandparents were children of the 2 world wars. And so of course they passed on stuff to me in terms of their fears. And one of the things my father, for instance, always said, that nuclear weapons were created out of the fear that there would be another war as destructive as the Second World War, without understanding that there would be, end up not being the weapons that stopped all wars, but actually come on top of wars, as it were. So they actually, brought more destruction. And my feeling is that we're now moving, we're all in the middle of a generational change. That's very clear to see in civil society. We're all struggling to find new people, new young people to take over from us. I'll be going soon as well, and I've got new people taking over my work, as it were. And what is really important to me is that this new generation, that the younger generation that's taking over this work, should not allow themselves, their work, and especially towards new policy, to only be defined by the generation that went before. And the feeling I have at the moment is that this war that started last year is somehow a last gasp of a Cold War generation that wants to return to something of the clarity of the old days when the Soviet Union was great again. And that this would be really terrible if we end up then clinging to nuclear weapons because of this. Because we were so far along the road already to talking about how to change the norm, how to ban them, how to get rid of them. And now it's like a hiccup in history. That sounds awful when having had the last panel, but it's like a big moment where suddenly this old thinking has re-arisen and is somehow trying to define our future. And it would be really important for me to see that the younger generation decides to take this into their own hands, liberate themselves from the previous generations, and look for alternative ways to get out of the mess that we've got ourselves into. That would be the message I would want most of all to give to you. And I hope that you all get into policy making and change it, because it's not going so good at the moment.
Yeah, lots been said, and I maybe have the danger to repeat some things here, but maybe you're right. I think what has to happen, I've written down 3 things, so I'll just try to persuade you with that. I think, of course, there is the norm of disarmament. It's in the NPT, it's been long-standing. The TPNW is now pushing further, and I think to really make progress there, and the progress is legally obliged. We have to do that as an international community. Is absolutely central, and that has to do with the second point a bit, because we have heard a lot of criticism about deterrence theory here, and I think that's something important. Tobias also spoke about language, that also has a lot to do with deterrence theory. I think getting away from this idea of deterrence theory, and also of the idea that deterrence has prevented nuclear use in the past, is important, because really, if you look at the research, that's been conducted on why nuclear weapons haven't been used since 1945. Deterrence, of course, plays a role, but not every nuclear non-use situation, also not every close call can be explained through deterrence. We've heard about the nuclear taboo, so like a normative prohibition against the use of nuclear weapons. There's also people saying, well, there's a tradition of nuclear non-use. We've always done it like that. There's a loop of self-deterrence. There's also a book that talks about atomic anxiety that I find really interesting. So like an emotional, psychological thing that prevented nuclear war. And I know that you also had sessions with Benoit today, and Benoit talks about very persuadingly that also luck plays a large role in why nuclear weapons haven't been used, and that basically we had a lot of close calls that we cannot trace back to any of these issues, but luck. So that's the second point. Deterrence theory, rethink that, probably abandon that. And the third point I'd like to close with on that is democratize the nuclear sphere. We talked about that, and other people have mentioned that on the panel. But again, young people, marginalized people, affected people, it's important that the discourse is broad, because we know from norms research that the broader the discourse and the more access there is to really question norms and push new norms forward, the higher the chance is to actually achieve change.
Thank you. George Wilhelm Gaalhofer, maybe you can go next. Thank you.
Thank you. It's hard to speak after the panel, because I think I agree with pretty much everything that's been said. I mean, I jotted down a couple of things, but I think others have said pretty much all of them. I mean, one thing, of course, for us is to work to broaden the TPNW, both the membership in the treaty, but also really the underlying arguments and motivations. You know, this focus on shifting the debate away from this kind of very blunt national security doctrines focused on states, and towards the individual, towards the humanitarian consequences and the risks that actually underlie them, which not only then would reduce the legitimacy of nuclear weapons, nuclear deterrence, but would also do what Jannis very eloquently just said, which is to further empower both countries, but also relevant communities, leaders, and affected communities. And that's, I think, extremely important, because that's really one of the things that is moving the debate forward nationally, but also internationally, to get that knowledge out and to get people, you know, even small countries who don't have the resources, to the table to voice their opinion. They have the right to be part of this conversation, and they are now taking us up, and this really is making a huge difference. And of course, being at the Young Security Conference, really it's also young people who are taking the charge, young people working in NGOs, in academia, doing the research, doing the outreach, doing, you know, talking to their politicians, working in civil society, that actually then pushes countries forward to engage in these conversations and to look at their own policies. So those are the things that I think one needs to focus on, and there is really, you know, there are, of course, history never happens in a vacuum, but there are important turning points, you know, and we actually find ourselves at quite an important turning point right now. This obviously might look different from other parts in the world than it does from the part of the world that we're in terms of the Russia war being seen as a European war by many in the global south, for example. But at the same time, we're talking here about the nuclear taboo, and the nuclear taboo that's gotten so severely weakened, and that despite the fact that these consequences being so grave and we're knowing so much about it, that we really do need to react, and we need people to actually take these arguments seriously and to consider it, and as others have said, to not think that this is something that we have to accept and can't do anything about, but that there actually is a possibility to engage and to affect change.
Thank you. And with that point about young people at the Young Security Conference, the powerful last word to an actual young person.
Okay, first technical things, but no. So I think I can also agree with almost everything that was said already, but I would add a few things. So I think one milestone really to, in the end, really achieve global zero is really strengthening the norms that the GPNW consists of. And I think one really big step towards was the declaration from the G20 that was sadly not repeated at the G7. But I think it would be important that at next meetings such as that, the global leaders would actually come back to that and even enhance it more. The other things I noted down were already said by you, but coming back to being a parliamentarian, I think for us, the most important thing is to really focus on even working more together in the network and seeing how we can also push our governments together, because I mean, like, it's not going to be news to you that inside our coalition there are also quite different views on nuclear deterrence and nuclear weapons, and I think we can be quite proud that we actually managed to observe the MSP of the GPNW. But I think what is really important that also attending at the next MSP in November, which Germany will do, I think we really need to use that in empowering other governments, especially from the NATO, to observe as well, to strengthen the presence of NATO states at the MSP. Because I mean, like, we already talked about the global South, and of course it is not more important what NATO states do, but in the end, NATO is a nuclear alliance, so there has to be the shift in conscious there as well. So yeah, pretty much I could repeat everything you have said. So for me, it really is about focusing on networking with parliamentarians, with civil society, to really achieve all the goals that we talked about.
Thank you so much, and thank you all of you. I think this was a really fruitful and really dense, maybe also discussion. So let me turn it over to you guys. Since everybody on the panel pretty much agreed on a lot of things, I really encourage you to also ask questions that don't agree with what people have been saying. And I already see that I don't need to encourage anybody because people are already showing up. Yes, Sophie, how about you just give it to whoever wants to start, and maybe we collect sort of 3 questions and then we give it to the panel to answer them.
Thank you very much. You've mentioned deterrence theory quite often, and one sub-theory you might say you find in deterrence theory is the stability and stability paradox. And I would be interested in your opinion, in your view on the impact of nuclear weapons on smaller scale conflicts and conventional warfare.
Hi, thank you very much for your contributions. I have a silly question, I guess, for Ms. Spellerberg as an MP, but also for the rest of the panel if anyone would like to jump in. I say it's silly but I genuinely don't have an answer to it. So this country has phased out nuclear energy after Fukushima, it has been mentioned in the panel. Yet there are still US nuclear weapons on German territory. The silly question is, how does that make sense?
Hello, thank you for this very interesting panel. So my question would be, now generally we're talking about the decline of the liberal international order. We're seeing ground norms that fly out of the window that are being disregarded. We're talking on the one side about the democratization of the whole nuclear weapons issue, which I am completely on board, don't get me wrong. On the other hand, we see democratic backsliding going on. So we are really at the point of insecurity generally, I have the feeling, especially in the normative realm. So hence my question is how then, while we are being in this moment of severe erosion, how that fits with your attempt of creating a new norm, changing the norm on nuclear weapons, being normalized, that we have them, that we may use them even. That's my question.
Thank you, all of you. Before we actually respond to these questions, I just want to get a quick sense of how many questions we have for how much time, so the panelists can have a sense of that. Could those of you who have questions already right now and know that already, please just raise your hand just really quickly, just so we can see. Okay, so we have about maybe 3 more questions. Okay, so technically, we have about 15 minutes left. Maybe we can start with the first 3 questions now and then take some more. Yes, whoever wants to respond.
Okay, I mean, I can pick up the question on the liberal international order, intersocietal cleavages in the West. That's why I'm really arguing for small steps and really for reaching out to different opinions, even when you talk about nuclear deterrence and disarmament. Maybe from a German perspective, just connect with the Baltics, with Poland, their view on European security, on disarmament. Because really, you have to form a coalition between government, civil society, and things. That's pretty much what Merle also said, about networking. It's really creating critical mass. And of course, I mean, our Western societies are also broken internally. Like I said, when you look at the GOP in the States, for example, in the Senate, there was a resolution on really demanding to get out of the New START treaty and to rearm in nuclear matters and to make life difficult for arms control. But it's difficult, and that's why also because of my role, I'm really arguing for small steps. And nuclear weapons in conventional war, in small wars, I mean, when you are very, very strong, great power, of course you don't need nuclear weapons. Let's say when you are the US and you go into Iraq, for example, you don't need them. For me, it's a great power thing, and really using deterrence, that's nuclear deterrent. In Ukraine, it's kind of a sign of weakness, of course, that Russia has to do it, because would we have a strong conventional military, it could went for regime change without using nuclear threats.
Merle, since you were dressed, maybe you also want to say something?
Yes, of course. Well, the nuclear sharing in Germany is obviously something that we as Greens do not support. But then again, if we look at the broader goal of actually achieving global zero and having nuclear disarmament, I think it is the question on how to look at it from a practical perspective. So of course, I do want to end nuclear sharing in Germany, but if we would do that from today to tomorrow, that would not lead to a total reduction of nuclear arms in total. So then maybe Germany would have a clean slate to say that, and we could say, well, now we can actually join the TPNW, everything's fine. But in the end, we would not achieve the goal of changing the discourse inside of NATO. And I think for us, it is more effective to focus on changing the discourse inside NATO to actually bring our allies to disarm in general, step by step. So of course, I'm happy. I will be definitely happy as soon as we will have the window of opportunity to end nuclear sharing in Germany. But right now, I do not think that it is the most effective way to actually achieve a more secure, a more safer world if we would end nuclear sharing right now, even though in the end, that's definitely what we need to do.
Yes, who wants to start?
Well, I'm sorry, Merle, I have to do this. So this is not the right time, in other words. I mean, I think this question about, how to fit together this very eroding situation and trying to create this new norm that you were asking about, I think this is exactly the right time to be doing it, because of the fact that it motivates us more when we are in a crisis situation. And in the past, I mean, go back to the nuclear power thing, that Fukushima was the motivation to end nuclear energy in the use of nuclear energy in Germany. And that's often the case, that great steps are taken also in the Cold War. Treaties were made when we realized how in danger we were. Now, the question of what are then the steps that you take when you realize you're in acute danger, and whether you say, okay, this is the moment to say, oh, we all lay down our arms, and then but one group says, well, we're not going to. And I think that's the problem that we're seeing at the moment, is this fear that unilaterally doing something. And I think that TPNW tries to answer that by saying, no, this is a multilateral process. Nobody is saying that you do it on your own. At first, we're gathering, all of the countries that just don't have nuclear weapons, cementing their commitment to nuclear disarmament by them saying, we've already joined the NPT, we're already in nuclear weapon-free zones, and now we're in TPNW, so it's clear we don't want nuclear weapons. That's the majority of the states of this world. That's something like 150 states are saying that from 192. That's a clear majority. And the question is to those that either have nuclear weapons or have a policy of nuclear deterrence, like Germany, if they could take at least the step to say, we will engage in the idea of developing this norm and joining it, and at the same time look at the different steps that need to be taken to reduce the risk, and how to actually, take part in a process that allows then the nuclear weapon states to safely disarm. That's the process that we have to be doing right now. And I don't think the time is the future. I think it's right now. I strongly agree about disagree about nuclear sharing, because I think the Belarus example that I gave before tells us this is a good time to try and negotiate that those nuclear weapons don't get placed in Belarus. And I think, just to say that, nobody has said this yet, but I'm sure somebody's thinking it, that you can't negotiate with Putin. We do have to do that, and we have done it with the Black Sea grain agreement, and we really do need to do some actual talking around the war. Even if we can't negotiate an end to the war immediately, we need to reduce down at least the biggest dangers, and that is one of them. Once they've put those nuclear weapons in Belarus, it's going to be really difficult to get them back out again.
Yeah, I also wanted to react, of course, to Merle Spellerberg and nuclear sharing. Not much of a surprise, but I think we have to ask ourselves what nuclear sharing really is. And I think because nuclear sharing and the nuclear weapons in Germany and the technology that we have there in Büchel, it's not something you can or would ever use in a war. So it's nothing militarily, right? It's not a militarily valuable thing to have, even if you assume that nuclear weapons have a military value. So if it isn't, because that's very old technology there. If that isn't, what is it? And I think it's a symbol, first and foremost. It's a symbol of a shared belief in deterrence and the value of nuclear weapons. And I think that such a powerful symbol, abolishing such a powerful symbol, is also a step toward disarmament, a step toward nuclear abolition, and that's exactly how you change norms. And I think that's why that could be something very important to do, and that's, I think, why initiating that would be, the sooner the better. I think this is the right time, yes. And on the other questions, democratic backsliding, it's a bit boring that I always answer with norms, but it's also the case there that even if you have democratic backsliding, even if you have authoritarian regimes, if you have global norms that are pushed by states, these global norms also have an effect on authoritarian states. If you, for instance, look at how China deals in this situation, and how the Chinese wording after pressure changed on Russian nuclear blackmailing and on Russian nuclear deterrence, that's also something that has to do with how norms work. And yeah. I can also say something on the stability-instability paradox, just very briefly, because I don't think it always fits, and I think that for instance, if we look also at Russia and Ukraine, the stability instability paradox, as far as I understand it, is a paradox that was developed to describe a situation between two nuclear weapon states. So it doesn't really apply there. I think that's something that in the debate always gets thrown around because it gets applied very often to the situation. I don't think it really does.
Thank you. Okay, there were more questions. So how about, do we still have the mic somewhere? Because the people online, oh, you perfectly, great, then you guys go ahead.
Thank you, first of all, for being here and talking to us about the risks of nuclear weapons. I think you might just have touched a bit on what I'm going to ask, but I still need to ask you this. So with the way I understood it, the end goal would be the disarmament of all nuclear weapons. And, but it seems to me that this situation kind of resembles the famous prisoner's dilemma, because it seems to me that none of the main nuclear powers are interested in giving up their weapons because they don't trust that the others would disarm their own weapons. So, and there's this mistrust among them. You mentioned previously that nobody thought that the Cold War would end, the Cold War era would end, and it did. But I think even if it did, and the mistrust, for example, still continues till today, how could agencies and external players in general shape that mistrust that still lingers today among these main nuclear powers?
Perfect. Just hand it on, yes.
Thank you very much. I guess I have more of a comment rather than a question, but I will put a question mark at the end, so it sounds like a comment, a question. You've mentioned that the nuclear weapons will be placed in Belarus and that supposedly Belarusian officials would actually be trained to use them. I'm not sure if it's actually correct.
It is.
I'm Belarusian, and I follow the news because from what I've heard is basically the idea that perhaps Belarusians wouldn't be actually able to use them, and there is a big narrative back at home that supposedly that's actually a new tool of Putin to ensure that the regime of Lukashenko actually persists. But also the fact that perhaps it further subjugates the country and completely gives up the autonomy of the country, and at the same time also ensures that Belarus is even deeper in the conflict itself.
Right.
Perhaps could you comment on that as well, please?
Yeah. A really interesting question. Thank you so much for that perspective. I think we could collect just maybe 2 more questions before we answer them. And I see 2 questions over here, so I think that's...
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I actually really have to leave on time.
Okay,
so I'm really sorry.
Is there one that you would like to say? Oh, it's already 1:30. So yes, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. I think on behalf of everybody here. Yeah, have a lovely evening.
Thank you very much, and have a nice discussion until the end. See you very soon.
Thank you.
So thanks a lot for all these fascinating informations. And as you mentioned the Ukraine war several times, I keep asking myself, is that how we should read that? Because Ukraine was a nuclear power. It had nuclear weapons. It gave them up in exchange for some vague security guarantees. And wouldn't you read the example of Ukraine as an example for it's not a good idea to give up deterrence unilaterally?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much.
So my question is very brief, and maybe it's already been touched upon, but my question was, with authoritarian regimes such as Iran or North Korea, could one argue that getting rid of nuclear weapons, at least in the West, is impossible if they still have them? Does the panel agree with that statement?
Okay, a lot of challenging questions. Who wants to go first?
Okay, should I? Maybe.
It's a pattern tonight.
I'm still playing the role of the policy guy, you know, and on the idea, on the way forward, and like you mentioned that for the nuclear great powers, it's very, very difficult to disarm. Again, that's why I would argue for taking small steps. One idea would be there's a so-called all-start treaty, where some American scientists, push the idea that Russia and the US should agree to the nuclear warhead limits of New START, and then the other P5 countries, France, Britain, and China, should join this new framework, a treaty, without agreeing to numerical limits, but with sharing information on their nuclear posture, doctrine, fissile material with the other P5 states, and also agree that their statements are being verified, for example. That's really the policy approach. And to Belarus, there's also the argument that for Russia, putting nukes or doing this in the future to Belarus was kind of to punish Poland, to build up a deterrence against Polish, from Russian perspective, aggression in the war in Ukraine. Yeah.
Just before asking anybody here, George Wilhelm Gallagher, would you like to say something just to not exclude you for being online?
Thank you. Yes, with pleasure. Especially on this question of the prisoner's dilemma. I mean, there is of course very, very good precedents for exactly this kind of situation. One is the chemical weapons prohibition that you had with the 1925 protocol, where at the time it was also thought that you needed to have chemical weapons in order to maintain a deterrent. Yet, when it became clear how absolutely abhorrent these weapons were, we were able to have a breakthrough and come together and ban them. And the same thing applies to landmines, for example, which were thought to be absolutely essential for countries to have in their arsenals in order to deter other countries from crossing the borders, etc. So there is very clear cases of precedent where then countries came together, and the landmine example is actually a very good one in terms of also something that Jannis and I mentioned earlier, which is the effect of norms that can go beyond just the simple countries signing up to them, but actually can have indirect effects of the pressure being so high that even countries that haven't joined the treaty not anymore using these kind of weapons, or for example, production becoming nearly impossible because of these international norms being in place. And maybe just a quick word, because I don't want to dominate the discussion too much on that, on the question of the value of having nuclear weapons, that sort of touches on both questions on Ukraine, but also on Iran and North Korea. I mean, the question is really, what is the actual practical use cases where these nuclear weapons would make a difference large enough? And you go through that, and there's been very good work done on that, for example, by Princeton and others, to sort of look at the implications and the actual effects of the nuclear weapon use, where you see that actually the problem with nuclear weapons often is that they're very much a 1 or 0. It's basically annihilation or nothing. But what do you do when you need something more precise, when you need an instrument? I mean, if you talk to a lot of retired military, high-level military from nuclear-armed countries, many of them actually really dislike, once they're retired and can speak freely, nuclear weapons, because they consume an incredible amount of money, which then is not available to the militaries in those countries for things like quick reaction troops and those sort of things, which you could actually use in military conflict situations, compared to these very 1 or 0, if you like, nuclear weapons. So there's also a question, actually, the more you delve into it, to what extent these things are more a matter of prestige, power projection, compared to actual military value. Thank you.
Shall I go? Yeah, the lack of interest in disarmament is is palpable at the moment. That's true when we talk about the nuclear weapon states. But again, there's another precedent, which is the whole process that started between Reagan and Gorbachev, where they built up that, there was an extreme mistrust. I mean, before the 1986 meeting in Reykjavik, there was this big moment in history in 1983 with the Able Archer military maneuver, which involved practicing with nuclear weapons, where the Russians were in such mistrust of the West that they actually believed that they were going to be attacked out of that maneuver. And so you can see the level of mistrust was in the 80s was extremely high, and yet it was possible for Reagan and Gorbachev to sit down in Reykjavik and actually talk about getting rid of all nuclear weapons. And the only thing that stopped them at that stage of actually agreeing on them was the question of missile defense. And if you look at the transcripts, which are online, of that discussion between the two of them, it's really interesting, because you see how it works, this actual, how diplomacy really works, all the stuff that goes on in the back channels and whatever that makes it, that reduces this mistrust and makes it possible to actually talk about disarmament. And I don't think that it's really that there's no interest in disarming, because of course nuclear weapons, intrinsically threaten our existence, and it would be mad to think that they didn't want to get rid of them. There's no real profit for the states themselves in having them. To go to the question of the Belarusian nuclear sharing, that's very interesting. What you say, we actually had, ICANN just had quite a good op-ed on the question together with the leader of the Belarusian opposition. And I think it's really true to say that once you get into this nuclear sharing question, the autonomy becomes more difficult. And that's certainly true on the Western side, that every time it's come up in the past 20 years as to whether or not we could discuss getting rid of nuclear sharing, there was a chorus from NATO saying, yeah, but then, the unity of the alliance is put into question. So it's impossible really to break free of this idea. And I just see this as an opportunity to say, okay, now if it's being suggested on the other side that this is going to happen, it would be an opportunity for us to say that's a good time to talk about getting rid of it on all sides. Which brings me to a point that I wanted to make and I haven't made so far, which is the question of what is it that we could also do, another step that we could take to actually de-escalate the situation would be to try to delegitimize all forms of nuclear threat rhetoric, and not just say it's Russia that's being irresponsible by threatening us, but actually say we don't want that kind of nuclear threat rhetoric at all. Because it's not the first, as I said before, it's not just Russia that's done it. We had this with the North Korean crisis with Trump and Kim Jong-un talking about, which button is bigger and who could destroy the other better. So that would be a really big step also towards getting rid in the long term of nuclear deterrence, which is based on the idea of threatening the others. And the last question was, the last two questions was about actually, who starts first? Can you get rid of nuclear weapons unilaterally? Again, the TPNW doesn't envisage unilateral disarmament as such. It doesn't say one nuclear weapon state has to give them up and the others can keep them. That's not the idea. The idea is to make a plan to join, make plans, and then do it together. That's what it's about. And this is a big problem about NATO saying, for instance, as long as nuclear weapons exist, we will remain a nuclear alliance. It's like last man standing. So everybody else has to disarm, and then NATO will disarm. And this is like negotiating through a position of strength. It means that it probably won't work. It all has to be done together. Otherwise, I don't think it's going to work. And just to remind you, Iran doesn't, as far as I know, have nuclear weapons yet. Well, we'll see.
All right. Just two, because I think we're over time. Just two very quick points to end that. And I think one important thing to grab onto here was, again, the bigger button discussion.
Yeah.
And just want to point toward that. Again, this has a very gender dimension to it. This bigger button discussions, the power talk, and so on and so forth. And I think once society also gets more aware of that, of language itself, that might also be a chance. Just very eager, could talk on and on about that, but we don't have the time. Just a little debunk on Ukraine and on the nuclear weapons in Ukraine, because according to the information I have, at least, please correct me if I say anything inaccurate, the nuclear weapons that were in Ukraine at the time were not under the authority of Ukraine, of the Ukrainian government, that was newly independent. So the thing is that they couldn't control the nuclear weapons. There probably would have been the technology, as far as I understand that, to use the nuclear material in the nuclear weapons and build new nuclear weapons themselves, which is hard to do undetected. And of course, Russia detecting that would have probably acted as well. So I think this is kind of the wrong path there, because we're kind of asking a question that isn't really a question that is very accurate, because Ukraine, as far as I understand, had never control about on the nuclear weapons that were on their territory.
Thank you all so much for being here, and you especially also, George Wilhelm, online, and everybody who came from far away from Munich and Berlin and / Greece. And also everybody here who came. I think really the big takeaway that I would also taking home is this point that all of you have made repeatedly: the chance of this happening is not zero. And the risk maybe now of miscalculation, of other things happening, is higher as transparency measures, as arms control measures are being reduced, than we can tolerate, basically. And so the question becomes, what can we reasonably do about this fact? Because if the chance is not zero, the risks are really high because of the consequences that we've heard about.